mean, when I talk about money, So when we talk about the central bank's role, then we better start with the central bank's balance sheet. And the central bank's balance sheet, in a very stylized way, is we have assets and liabilities. On the asset side, we have foreign assets of the central bank, the so-called foreign exchange reserves. We have claims on governments, and we have other assets. On the right-hand side, we have currency outside banks, which is cash that you and I hold. Commercial bank reserves, which is including the cash held by commercial banks. So commercial banks have their accounts with the central bank. It's like a checking account for the commercial bank that the central bank administers, and then there's other liabilities in central bank equity. Now, if you take that to the data, then you will be surprised by how complicated real-world balance sheets look like, but this is the stylized version. Now, just to currency outside banks are coins and banknotes, cash. Commercial bank reserves are claims of commercial banks against the central bank. And the monetary base, that's a very important thing, is the currency outside banks plus commercial banks reserves. Right? So this cash that's held by people who are not banks, plus the commercial banks reserves, which includes the cash held by commercial banks. Now, an important relationship is the transactions that increase the volume of central bank assets usually also increase the monetary base. So the size of the balance sheet, I mean, the size of the volume of assets is always equal to the volume of liabilities. So if, and that's important, if, for example, the domestic central bank buys foreign assets and doesn't do anything else, that also increases the money supply, usually commercial bank reserves. So that's something to which we will return when we talk about foreign exchange interventions. So here just some pictures to look at. This is the evolution of the Euro ECB's balance sheet over time, assets and liabilities. And what you see is here the gigantic expansion of the expansionary monetary policy of the in the wake of the global financial crisis. Right? So you see a pretty moderate increase, which is okay. But then you see, especially starting 2015, a massive increase of that balance sheet. And of course, you see it on the asset side, and you see it on the liability side. And you see that, first and foremost, the amount of government bonds on the books of the ECB increased. So the ECB was buying government bonds big time on the secondary market. And you see that this was reflected by a massive increase of commercial bank reserves. So liquidity, the monetary base, increased substantially in the 2010s. You also see that quite recently it has decreased because when inflation picked up in 2021 and 2002, then the central bank went against it, reducing the money supply. That's the Fed's balance sheet, and you see similar things, right? Especially during COVID. During COVID, the Fed's balance sheet expanded substantially. And again, what did the Fed do? Well, the Fed took a lot of government bonds on its books. And you also see that this is first and foremost reflected by commercial banks' reserves. You see that steady increase of currency / cash. But the volatile thing that's really been expanding is commercial bank reserves. The last picture is just the monetary base in the euro area, right? You see that currency has steadily increased, which for a growing economy is something that you would expect. For commercial bank reserves, you see these, you see the global financial crisis, and then you see the first wave of the European debt crisis, and then you see the fight against European deflation, and then you see COVID. And you see quite recently a decrease in the monetary base, which means that the ECB has become more contractionary. Now preliminary remarks. When we talk about creating distributing base money, I will focus on the ECB. Other central banks' operating procedures are similar. And the ECB's operational framework has changed as of September 2024. That's pretty novel yet. So how does the ECB influence the monetary base? Well, it influences the monetary base through the so-called main refinancing operations, which means that as a commercial bank, you can turn to the ECB and say, look, we need cash. We need money, we need liquidity. And these MROs take place once a week, and the maturity is usually once a week. So it's like a collateralized credit that the commercial banks get from the central bank. They get money, they offer some asset as a collateral, and then when basically it's a repo, right? So they basically sell that asset to the central bank, and then they buy it back at the same time. Now, apart from that, there's long-term financing operations, which is collateralized credit to commercial banks with a longer maturity, like 3 months. This term fixed rate full allotment is very important in the European context, because it used to be the case that there were auctions. So the ECB was collecting bids from commercial banks and said, look, folks, we have this main refinancing operation coming along. Do you need liquidity, and what do you offer in terms of interest rate? And then the commercial bank offering the highest interest rate was served first, and the second, then kind of the ECB worked its way down to the marginal bank that was still served. But there were also banks that didn't get anything. Now that has changed, and there's full allotment. So if you raise your hand and you participate in this main refinancing operations and you need liquidity, you get it. And there's no competition among banks, right? You get it at a fixed interest rate. This is an inheritance of these turbulent years of these various crises in the recent past. There's also a thing that's called the marginal lending facility, which is credit to commercial banks outside the MROs at the marginal lending rate. And then there's a thing called the deposit facility, which means that commercial banks can deposit liquidity at the central bank, and they may actually earn an interest rate on that. And that's the so-called deposit facility rate. Now, the ECB communication focus on the DFR, which is called the Leitzins. The main refinancing operation rate is the DFR plus 0.15 percentage points, and the MLF rate is the MRO rate plus 0.25 percentage points. Don't learn that by heart, right? It's not just, that's also why I'm very quick. What the ECB also does, it purchases assets on the secondary market. That was what it did during quantitative easing. So the ECB and the Fed, they did something that they would have never done 20 years earlier. Go to the financial market and buy government bonds. When the ECB started doing that, people said you are basically violating all the principles that you have defended for decades. Now, the ECB and the Fed at that time said, look, we are in an exceptional situation, we have to do that. So there's these different programs like the asset purchasing program, the pandemic emergency purchase program. They have these fancy names, but that's behind those. Quantitative easing is behind those, this massive increase in the monetary base that we saw in the 2010s. Now these are the policy interest rates, right? And you see when the euro was born, then money was quite expensive. Then the policy interest rates were reduced, then it was increased again. And then the global financial crisis struck. And then we came into the phase where the main refinancing rate was 0. So you didn't have to pay any interest rate on the liquidity as a commercial bank on the liquidity that you got. And the marginal, the deposit facility rate was negative. So if you deposited money as a commercial bank at the central bank, you didn't get an interest, you had to pay an interest, which the ECB implemented to prevent banks from depositing liquidity at the central bank and instead to lend it out to firms and households. And you see that quite recently when inflation rates increased substantially in the euro area, these rates were increased big time, right? So that was very quick. Okay. The central bank's operating target is it's to affect commercial banks' refinancing conditions on the interbank lending market, the so-called money market, as reflected by a thing called the euro short-term rate. It used to be called EONIA, but it's been recently replaced by the euro short-term rate. So this is very important to see, right? In the United States, it's called the federal funds rate. Now, the bottom line is, let me skip the term structure. The bottom line is there is a money market, which is a market where commercial banks exchange liquidity. So you have bank A that needs liquidity and you have bank B that has some liquidity to spare. And then they interact. And that's a market, and there's a market price of liquidity, which is a short-term interest rate. So this is now what the central bank does, it tries to influence this exchange rate or this interest rate by its own operations, right? So that's something that's often misperceived in the public discussion. It seems like the central bank is determining interest rates. It's not, right? It's trying to affect those interest rates through its own actions. And you see that when times were normal in the early 2000s, it was like establishing a corridor within which the money market interest rate fluctuated. In times of crisis, the money market interest rate converged to this lower bound. But still, the policy interest rates did have an effect on financing conditions on the interbank market, right? So that's important because, as I said, in the general perception, it seems like the central bank, the head of the central bank, makes a phone call to commercial banks and says, "Look, folks, we don't want to see you lend or borrow at another interest rate than at the one that we define." That's not the case. Good. Now, since 2008, the central banking is almost permanent crisis mode, right? And there's all kinds of things that I have to add. Now, let me, in the interest of time, let me get to the next step. So you have, the first step is that the central bank is offering liquidity / monetary base to commercial banks. The second step is that commercial banks use this money and increase the money supply. How is that done? Well, it's done through multiple deposit creation. So it's done by commercial banks using the monetary base to extend credit to firms and households, and you have a multiplier effect that additional credit creates deposits which can be used for further credit extension. Right? So you have Bank A that gets liquidity from the central bank, hands out a credit to a firm, the firm pays a bill, the money that was used for payment ends up on the checking account of another firm, and that firm or of another bank, and that bank can use that money to hand out even more credit. So there's a thing called the money multiplier. And so the actual change in monetary aggregates is bigger than initial change in monetary base. And the process is limited by clients' withdrawal of cash and banks' holding of required reserves and excess reserves. This system is called the fractional reserve system because banks hold a part of their deposits as reserves. Actually, if there's required reserves, they have to hold this, and they can lend out the rest. Well, as a consequence, if we define the monetary base to be C tilde, which is currency and commercial bank reserves, and monetary aggregate M1 is currency and deposits, and you assume that commercial banks required excess reserves is a multiple row of deposits, then what you get eventually is that, and we assume that there's no cash, then you can combine these equations and you can show that an increase in the monetary base results in an increase of money in circulation. And 1 over rho is the so-called money multiplier. So the bottom line is the following, and let me now, there's money demand of firms and households. There's money supply of, the financial sector. Part of the financial sector is the central bank. The central bank generates liquidity / monetary base. But it's not just the central bank that creates money, it's also the banking system. Because the banking system hands out credit, the credit ends up on some other bank's books, that money can be used to hand out even more credit. And the reason why the whole process doesn't make the money supply explode is that there's some reserve holding. Good. Slightly more complicated version is down here. This is, by the way, M0, the monetary base. The M1, which is commercial bank reserves and cash. And you see that the monetary base has gone up quite substantially. The M1 in the euro area has gone up as well, but the money multiplier has actually gone down. So the speed at which the liquidity provided by the central bank was turned into M1 decreased, which at that time was perceived as kind of a problem because it reflected commercial banks not taking the liquidity to give credit to firms, but actually sitting on this and not using it. Okay, all this, some important remark. Let me wrap up, and I was very quick because, trust me, this will not be at the heart of the exam, right? But it's important to know, right? It's important to know to go away from that idea that money is cash and increasing the money supply is putting on the printing press. That's just ridiculous. So money is more than cash. So the metaphor of the printing press is misleading for at least 2 reasons. First of all, a large part of the monetary base consists of the central bank's temporary credit to commercial banks. So the monetary base can easily be reduced by the central bank not extending credit anymore. And the money supply is endogenous. And this is important to know, although I will deviate from it later on. Money supply depends on commercial banks' demand for base money and agents' decision on cash holdings and commercial banks' decisions on reserve holdings and credit extension. So in our models, we usually say money supply is exogenous. In reality, it's not, right? It's something that is very, very much depends on banks and households and firms' decisions. That's something that is, in most macro models, swept under the rug, which is problematic, but you have to simplify at some point. Let me skip that. Good. So, before I go into this, let me ask you, is that the same in Vietnam? So how does the money supply work in Vietnam? Do you know? I mean, do you have the same system of the central bank, the State Bank of Vietnam, providing commercial banks with the monetary base, And then you have this money multiplier process where commercial banks take the liquidity, hand it out in terms of credit, and then the credit ends up on the books of another bank, and the bank can use this liquidity to hand out even more credit. This is something, if you don't know it, try to find out. Also try to find out whether there's something like an operational target like the federal funds rate or the Euro short-term rate that the State Bank of Vietnam targets. And also try to find out what is the required reserve ratio, the required reserves in Vietnam, right? That is something that you should know. I mean, that's kind of the details of the money supply process. And it's important to know these details. These details change, right? So only knowing the details is okay. So let me give it a try, right on the spot. I think what is required reserves in Vietnam? There you go. Reserve requirement ratios, search. So types of credit institutions. Oh, that's interesting. What was rho in our model? Now let me go back to this. Right? We assumed that commercial banks held a fraction rho between 0 and 1 of their deposits as reserves. The original idea of this thing was stabilize the banking system. Why is that? Well, because if you suppose that you lend out all the money that you've collected from customers, and then customers show up and say, look, I want to withdraw my money. And you say, oh, I'm sorry, I've just lent it out. So for that reason, those required reserves were introduced. Now, in the European area, in the ECB, I think the required reserves ratio is close to 0. Now, you see that the State Bank of Vietnam distinguishes between different banks. It says people's credit funds, microfinance institutions have a required reserves ratio of 0. And other credit institutions have a required reserves ratio depending on the maturity of deposits. That's interesting. It is interesting for different reasons. The first reason is it shows that something like this fractional reserve system is also at play in Vietnam, right? So it's not completely different from what happens in the United States and in Europe. But you have a twist, which is a differentiation across credit institutions. Whether this makes sense or not, that's not, for me to judge now. But I really encourage you, not in the context of this course, but for your own, education, to try to figure out whether you know how the money supply process works in Vietnam. Good. And I mean, suppose I had typed in required reserve Vietnam, and I would have gotten nothing, then this would have indicated that apparently the money supply process in Vietnam is very different from, what I've been telling you. And the good news is it's apparently not. All right. Now let's go into the exchange rate basics. Good. Let's define exchange rate regimes. Now, let me start with a very simple statement that The nominal exchange rate is a relative price. And it's a relative price that's determined on a market, which is the foreign exchange market. That's the thing that we should always fall back on. Now, on every market you have supply and demand. And what are the sources of supply and demand on forex market? Well, you have individuals, firms, public institutions buying and selling currencies to buy and sell goods and services whose prices are denominated in different currencies, and to buy and sell assets whose price and returns are denominated in different currencies. So when coming here at the airport, I changed some euros into Vietnamese dong because I knew that if I go to the Bang Cat, I don't have a bank account here, and if I go to the Bang Cat street market and I want to buy fruit, I better have some Vietnamese dong. It's as simple as that. So I bought Vietnamese dong because I wanted to buy Vietnamese goods. Yesterday I paid my bill for the apartment that I've been renting for the past couple of days. I had to pay a price in Vietnamese dong, which I charged my credit card, but of course that meant that someone had to, on my behalf, buy Vietnamese dong such that I could pay my bill and sell euros. So I bought a service and I had to acquire Vietnamese dong to pay the service. Now this is one of the sources of demand. The other one is to buy and sell assets. So if I want to buy a US government bond, I have to have dollars to start with because the US government bond is denominated in dollars. If I want to buy a bond issued by the Vietnamese government, and suppose that it's issued in Vietnamese dong, I need Vietnamese dong. So we have different motivations to buy and sell currency. Now, depending on the exchange rate regime, central banks, or more generally monetary authorities, buy and sell currencies to affect the nominal exchange rate. If the exchange rate is flexible, then the central bank does nothing. If the exchange rate is fixed, then the central bank has a mandate to what we call defend the peg. I say monetary authorities because, interestingly, when the United States does foreign exchange interventions, which is very rare, it's not the central bank, but it's part of the Treasury. I don't know why that is the case, but it's just the fact. Good. So now a flexible exchange rate, sometimes called a float, or with a flexible exchange rate, central banks do not officially try to influence the exchange rate. So they have no exchange rate target. So when you call Madame Lagarde from the ECB and you ask her, what is your preferred US dollar euro exchange rate, then she might give you a number. But if you ask her, do you have a mandate to implement that, then she would reply, no, right? Because we have a flexible exchange rate. I might be concerned about huge fluctuations on foreign exchange markets, but I have no mandate to start with to influence that. Now with a fixed exchange rate, which is sometimes called a peg, central banks announce a particular exchange rate, a parity, E-bar, and implement it through either foreign exchange interventions or by adjusting the domestic monetary policy. Here the idea is if you raise domestic interest rates, you make the domestic currency more attractive for foreign savers, and so people want to buy the domestic currency, so that prevents a depreciation and results in an appreciation. If you lower domestic interest rates, you go just in the opposite direction. So central banks have lots of tools to implement a peg. Now, let's interpret balance of payments equilibrium as foreign exchange market equilibrium. You've seen that before, right? CA plus KA equals FA NR plus delta RT plus 1. The balance on the current account balance on the capital account, never to be confused with the financial account, and the balance on the financial account.